Before we talk about Ronnie and Reggie Cray, forget the glossy photos, the tailored suits, and the lazy myth that they were somehow working-class princes who beat the system with charm and swagger. Strip all of that away, and what you're left with is something colder. Two men who understood, earlier than most, that fear can be packaged, sold, and traded like currency, especially in a city still bruised by war, poverty, and silence. London in the mid-20th century wasn't just a backdrop for their rise, it was the kind of place where people learned to mind their own business, because surviving often meant not seeing too much. The Crays didn't invent that code, but they mastered it, and they used it to build an empire that looked like celebrity from a distance and felt like a trap up close. They were born on October 24, 1933, in the East End, an area that carried its own accent, its own rules, and its own bruises. Reggie arrived first, by minutes, but from the beginning the twins were treated like a single story with two faces. Their family life was a mix of tight bonds and loose foundations. Their father, Charles, drifted in and out, partly because of the kind of work he did, partly because he seemed to prefer the road and the pub to the slow grind of responsibility. Their mother, Violet, was the fixed point, the center of gravity, the one constant presence that shaped them more than any teacher, police officer, or preacher ever would. People later tried to turn Violet into a simple stereotype, either a saint who tried her best or a mother who spoiled monsters. But the truth is usually messier than that. In a neighborhood where families often had very little, being fiercely protective could look like spoiling. And when the world outside feels threatening, a mother's love can become both shelter and fuel. The twins grew up in a London where the war was not a chapter in a history book. It was in the air, in the buildings, in the rationing, in the stories adults told, with that flat, tired voice people use when they've seen too much and can't afford to feel it every day. It's hard to explain to a modern audience how normal hardship could become, how quickly violence could be filed away as just the way it is. In the East End, you learned early who had power, who had connections, who could hurt you, and who could make problems disappear. And for two boys who would later build their entire identity around control, the environment was a classroom. At school, they weren't the cartoon villains people imagine when they hear the word gangster. Teachers and neighbors often described them as capable of being polite, even cooperative when it suited them. That detail matters because it's the first hint of what they would become. Not wild criminals who couldn't control themselves, but calculated men who could switch masks depending on the room. The same person who can smile and help at a school event can also learn, later, to smile at a nightclub table while ordering violence like it's a drink. Those two things are not opposites, they're part of the same skill set. The Crays learned early that reputation isn't built only through what you do, it's built through what people believe you might do. Their bond as twins became its own mythology even before they were famous. Some accounts describe them as unusually close, so close that they didn't really need anyone else. Whether you take every dramatic detail literally or not, the pattern is clear. They moved as a unit, defended each other as a reflex, and developed a shared sense of identity that made them difficult to separate psychologically. That kind of bond can be beautiful in healthy circumstances, but in unhealthy circumstances it becomes dangerous because it reduces outside influence. When your entire world is your brother and your mother and everyone else is optional, then empathy becomes selective. Loyalty becomes the highest law. And once that's true, the line between protecting your own and destroying anyone who threatens your own gets thinner every year. There's a moment in their early life that many biographers point to as symbolic, a serious childhood illness where they were separated, and Ronnie in particular struggled. Their mother insisted she understood him better than doctors did and eventually brought him home. Even if you don't want to psychoanalyze it too hard, you can see the emotional logic that forms. The outside world doesn't understand us. Outsiders can't be trusted. Family is the only safe place. It's the kind of belief that, once embedded, makes later choices easier to justify. When they grew older, differences between the twins became clearer. Reggie often appeared more socially smooth, more presentable, more capable of playing the businessman. Ronnie was quieter, heavier with intensity, and later, famously, more volatile. Together, those differences created a brutal balance. One twin could charm a room, while the other could freeze it. By their late teens, they were moving toward boxing, which was more than sport in that world. Boxing offered status, structure, and a legitimate path upward, especially for working-class boys who needed a way out that didn't require connections they didn't have. It also offered something else, a socially accepted form of aggression. Fighting was celebrated as toughness, as discipline, as masculinity. If you were already wired toward dominance, boxing didn't change you. It trained you. It taught you how to read people, how to keep your nerve, how to enjoy the moment someone else loses control. Those are not just athletic skills, they're criminal skills too. Once the ring becomes the street, then came the moment that shoved them further off the rails: national service. In the early 1950s, young British men were still being called up, expected to do their time in uniform. For the Crays, the army wasn't a duty, it was an insult. They didn't want to be managed. They didn't want to be spoken to like ordinary recruits. They wanted to be feared and respected, not ordered around. When they resisted, it wasn't quiet resistance. It turned into violence, into assaults, into going absent without leave, into a steady escalation that forced the system to deal with them. And here's a theme you'll see again and again in their story. When authority challenged them, they didn't negotiate. They made the situation so chaotic that authority paid a price for confronting them. That tactic, used early, would later become part of their empire. People didn't back down from the Crays because they loved them. People backed down because it was easier and safer. Their first real taste of prison life didn't scare them straight. It did the opposite. Prison introduced them to professional criminals, to networks, to the unwritten rules of the underworld. It also gave them something they craved: a reputation. In some communities, especially in the mid-century East End, a short stint inside could function like a grim badge of authenticity. It told certain people you were real. It told others you were trouble. For ambitious young men who were building an identity around toughness and notoriety, that reputation was an asset, not a warning. When they finally came out, boxing was no longer the path. Too many records, too much heat, too many doors closing. So they chose another route, one that would let them control their image while building real power behind the scenes. They began with places that looked innocent enough from the outside: clubs, social spots, places where people came to relax. But these places weren't just businesses, they were headquarters. A club gives you a base, a reason to be around money, a reason people come to you, and a reason others don't ask too many questions. It also gives you leverage, gambling debts, secrets overheard, private backrooms where a conversation can become intimidation. The Crays didn't just want to make money. They wanted to own the atmosphere of a neighborhood, to be the name people said quietly, the name that made doors open and mouths shut. Their approach wasn't unique in the history of organized crime, but what made them stand out was how they blended old-school brutality with a modern understanding of publicity. They realized that being seen could be a form of protection. If you become famous enough, the wrong people hesitate. If you become socially connected enough, witnesses get nervous. If your face becomes familiar, you can hide in plain sight. That's the seed of celebrity gangster. Not a romantic archetype, but a strategy. And in London, a city where class and power were tangled together, the idea of East End men rising into elite spaces made the press curious, and curiosity is the first step toward myth. By the time Ronnie and Reggie hit their early teens, the East End wasn't just where they lived, it was the rulebook that raised them. Post-war London still carried the bruises of bomb sites and ration lines, but down their streets you could feel something else too, a kind of hard pride, a belief that respect wasn't given, it was taken. The twins learned early that a reputation could protect you better than any lock. You didn't need to be the biggest boy in the room, just the one everyone believed might go further than the others if pushed. That belief, the myth of what you might do, becomes its own weapon, and the Crays, even before they had money or muscle behind them, were already learning how to forge a myth around themselves. At school, they weren't bookish stars or obvious delinquents in the cartoon sense. They could be polite, even charming, especially with adults who knew how to handle them. But with other kids, it was different. Being twins made them a spectacle. People stared, teased, tested. That constant testing is a fire. Some people shrink from it. Others decide they'll never be humiliated again. The Crays took the second path. They fought because fighting gave them control of the moment. It made the world simple. You win, you lose, you're feared, you're ignored. No complicated emotions, no vulnerable explanations. And every time they fought side by side, they reinforced the truth that would define their lives. They didn't just have each other's backs, they were each other's backs. Their mother, Violet, was the anchor. She adored them, protected them, believed in them with the kind of fierce devotion that can feel like love and destiny all at once. In a neighborhood where men vanished into drink, work, prison, or war, Violet was steady. The twins fed off that steadiness. She was the safe place they returned to, the one voice they listened to when no one else could reach them. And in a strange way, her love was also a shield that kept consequences at bay. If a teacher complained, Violet could soften it. If a neighbor grumbled, Violet could shame them for judging. The twins learned that even when the world said no, there was at least one person who would always say, "Not my boys." That kind of unconditional loyalty can be beautiful, but it can also teach someone that the rules don't apply the same way to them. Then came the illness, diphtheria, and the separation. For most kids, a hospital stay is a blur of fear and strange smells. For twins who had barely ever been apart, it was like ripping a single identity into two pieces. Reggie recovered faster, Ronnie struggled longer, and something in that gap, one brother okay, one brother not, seemed to deepen the imbalance that people later noticed in them. Reggie, the talker, Reggie, the smoother one. Ronnie, quieter, heavier behind the eyes, the one who held things in. Ronnie didn't forget pain, he collected it. And when a person collects pain long enough, it doesn't stay as pain, it hardens into suspicion, it curdles into control. It becomes, if you're not careful, a hunger to make the world feel what you felt. Boxing gave them structure, it gave them training, discipline, a way to transform violence into sport and applause. In the East End, boxing wasn't just exercise, it was status. It offered a path out, at least in theory. You could be poor and still be someone if you could fight. The twins took to it the way they took to everything, with intensity, with pride, with an eye on reputation. But boxing also did something else. It taught them that fear is manageable, that pain is survivable, that if you can keep your head when your body screams, you can dominate the other man. Those lessons don't stay in a ring. They follow you into alleys, pubs, back rooms, and later into the kind of meetings where men talk quietly and make threats politely. And while their father drifted in and out of their lives like a bad weather system, sometimes present, mostly absent, the East End filled in the blanks. The streets taught them what adults rarely admit: there are two Londons. The one with rules and manners, and the one with money moving through shadows, where people solve problems without paperwork. They heard stories of protection rackets, of men who did horrible things and still walked free. They learned the oldest lesson of organized crime. The police don't have to like you if they fear the paperwork you can cause and the trouble you can bring. And in places where witnesses don't see nothing, fear becomes a kind of currency. When the state finally reached for them, national service, it wasn't just an obligation, it was an insult. The army demanded submission, routine, hierarchy. It demanded that the twins become small pieces in a big machine. But the twins didn't want to be pieces. They wanted to be the machine. And when they showed up and then tried to leave almost immediately, it wasn't just impulsiveness. It was a declaration: you don't own us. The moment violence entered that setting, punches thrown at authority, the die was cast. Suddenly, they weren't just local tough boys. They were a problem officially. Their early run-ins with the system did something crucial. It introduced them to prison culture before they were fully grown. Prison isn't just a place where criminals go. It's a university for certain kinds of ambition. You meet men who have done it longer, better, smarter. You learn who to avoid, who to trust, how to read a room, how to carry yourself, so no one thinks you're prey. And the twins, even on short stints, attracted attention. Not because they were seasoned masterminds, but because they had presence. They had that rare combination of nerve and charisma, the kind that makes older criminals think these boys could be useful, or dangerous, or both. Inside, the twins also learned something about performance. Rage can be strategic, chaos can be leverage. If you make yourself too difficult to manage, institutions start negotiating with you, quietly, indirectly, because it's easier than constant war. When they tried every trick to get themselves discharged, misbehavior, defiance, turning life into a circus, they weren't just acting out. They were testing how far pressure could move authority. They discovered that systems have limits, and if you push hard enough, sometimes the system chooses the path of least resistance. That's a terrifying lesson for someone who already believes rules are optional. And once the army chapter ended, the boxing dream dimmed. A criminal record and dishonorable stains don't exactly open doors in respectable society, especially in mid-century Britain. But for the twins, that wasn't tragedy, it was clarity. If the straight world wouldn't reward them, they'd build a world that would. They had contacts now. They had a taste of notoriety. And in the East End, notoriety is a seed. If you water it with fear, it grows fast. They began with something that looked legitimate on paper. A club, a place where men gathered, played snooker, drank, gambled, swapped stories. The kind of venue that could be written off as harmless entertainment, unless you knew what it really was. Because these places weren't just businesses, they were hubs. They were where information flowed, where deals were made, where debts were recorded in memory instead of ink. And once you control a hub, you don't just control money, you control people. Protection rackets are rarely introduced as violence. They're introduced as help, as security, as we'll make sure nothing happens. The genius of it is psychological. The victim pays to avoid a problem, and the criminal becomes the solution to the threat the criminal represents. In communities where police are distant or distrusted, that solution can feel like the only realistic option. The twins understood this instinctively. They could offer reassurance with a smile, and everyone in the room knew what the smile meant if you said no. Their public image started to form early, even before the celebrity era. Sharp suits, controlled manners when it mattered, a sense of theatre. The East End respected style because style signalled success. It said you'd risen above the grime without forgetting where you came from. And the twins were building a brand long before branding was a modern word. They weren't just criminals, they were an idea. Local boys who wouldn't be pushed around, men who looked like movie gangsters but spoke like neighbours, familiar enough to feel real, frightening enough to feel unstoppable. But even then, the split between them was becoming clearer. Reggie was the diplomat, the one who could sit across from someone and make them think they were safe while guiding them exactly where he wanted. Ronnie was the storm behind the calm, the one whose silence made people uneasy because they couldn't read him. Reggie could run a room, Ronnie could freeze it. And when you combine those two talents, charm and terror, You get a partnership that can expand very quickly because it can adapt to almost any situation. If persuasion fails, fear finishes the job. As their operations grew, so did the network around them. Men willing to do errands, collect debts, break hands, drive cars, move goods. In the underworld, loyalty isn't built on trust alone, it's built on shared risk. The twins offered belonging and protection, but they also demanded obedience. And slowly, as more people fell under their influence, they began to understand a deeper truth. The real power isn't in violence itself. The real power is in the reputation that violence creates, because a reputation saves you from having to fight every time. You only have to prove it once in a while. By the end of this phase of their story, they weren't yet the tabloid legends of the swinging 60s. They were something more dangerous in a way, rising figures in a tight-knit world, learning how to blend business with intimidation, learning how to make ordinary people complicit through silence, learning how to turn a neighborhood's fear into a private empire. And the scariest part wasn't what they had done so far, it was what they were clearly becoming. Men who believed that if the world wouldn't give them status, they could take it, and if the law stood in the way, the law could be bent, bought, or broken. By the late 1950s, the Cray Twins were no longer just names whispered in East End pubs. They were becoming a presence, something people felt even when they weren't in the room. This was the phase where small-time intimidation hardened into organized control, where favors turned into debts, and debts turned into fear. The East End had always lived with crime, but the Twins were changing its texture. They weren't content with scraps. They wanted dominance, and they wanted it to look inevitable. Their snooker club, and later other venues, became more than gathering places. They were symbols. If you walked into one of their establishments, you were walking into their territory, whether you acknowledged it or not. Men watched who came in, who spoke to whom, who looked nervous, who looked confident. Information was currency, and the Twins were building a quiet intelligence network long before anyone used that phrase. They knew who was in debt, who was cheating on who was skimming money, who had enemies. That knowledge allowed them to intervene or threaten to at exactly the right moment. Protection rackets expanded naturally from this setup. Shopkeepers didn't wake up one morning and decide they wanted to pay the Crays. They were nudged subtly at first. A friendly conversation, a reminder of a recent burglary down the street, an offer to keep an eye on things, and if that wasn't enough, something small would happen, a broken window, a warning visit. Never too much at first. The message was always calibrated. We can make life easier, or we can make it very hard. Most people chose easier. What made the Twins especially effective was that they didn't rely solely on random violence. Violence was precise, targeted, and theatrical. When someone needed to be made an example of, the Twins made sure people heard about it. Stories traveled fast in the East End, and stories were more powerful than fists. A single incident, well placed, could save them dozens of confrontations later. Fear, once planted, tends to maintain itself. At the same time, they were learning how to launder not just money, but image. Legitimate businesses became fronts, and fronts became shields. If questioned, they could point to licenses, leases, accountants. They weren't hiding in alleys, they were operating in plain sight. That visibility mattered. It blurred the line between criminal and businessman, making it harder for authorities and easier for the public to see where one ended and the other began. Reggie increasingly took on the role of strategist. He understood appearances, timing, and relationships. He knew when to press and when to step back. He could sit across from another gangster or a nervous business owner and speak calmly, even kindly, while steering the conversation exactly where he wanted it to go. Reggie made people feel included until they realized inclusion came with strings attached. Ronnie, meanwhile, remained the enforcer in spirit even when he wasn't throwing the punch himself. His reputation did much of the work. People knew that if Reggie was the voice, Ronnie was the consequence. Ronnie's presence had a chilling effect. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to threaten openly. His silences were often enough. People later described the way he looked at them. Not aggressive, not loud, just fixed, as if he were measuring them. That kind of attention unsettles people more than rage. It makes them feel seen, assessed, weighed. And once someone believes you are capable of anything, you rarely need to prove it. As their confidence grew, so did their ambition. They didn't want to remain confined to the margins of London life. They wanted recognition, influence, and a sense of importance that went beyond money. This was where the idea of the celebrity gangster truly began to form, not as a gimmick, but as a deliberate strategy. If they could move in circles where politicians, entertainers, and elites mingled, they would gain a different kind of protection. Not legal protection exactly, but social insulation. London itself was changing, and the Twins rode that wave expertly. The late 1950s and early 1960s were the prelude to what would later be called the swinging 60s. Old hierarchies were loosening. Youth culture was rising. Fashion, music, and nightlife were becoming central to the city's identity. In that environment, figures who looked stylish, confident, and rebellious could be mistaken for symbols of modernity rather than criminals. The Twins leaned into that confusion. They dressed sharply, cultivated a distinctive look, and made sure they were seen in the right places. Cameras loved them, photographers loved them, journalists, hungry for stories that blended danger and glamour, began to pay attention. The Twins understood the value of being photographed. A photograph fixes you in public imagination. It turns you into something larger than a rumor. And once you become an image, people start projecting their own fantasies onto you. Nightclubs became a key part of this expansion. These weren't just money makers, they were theaters. Places where deals happened under the cover of music and laughter. Places where celebrities brushed shoulders with criminals without always realizing or caring. Gambling clubs in particular were perfect environments. Money flowed freely. People lost more than they could afford. Debts piled up. And debt in the Cray world was leverage. A man who owed money was a man who could be pressured, recruited, or ruined. The Twins were careful about how they were perceived by ordinary people. They gave to charity. They helped neighbors. They paid for funerals. These gestures weren't random kindness. They were investments. In communities where the state often felt distant, someone who helped out locally could earn real loyalty. That loyalty translated into silence when the police came knocking. People didn't see the Twins as outsiders preying on them. Many saw them as our boys. Dangerous, yes, but also familiar, even protective. But inside their organization, things were darker. Loyalty was demanded, not requested. Mistakes weren't tolerated for long. Fear wasn't just directed outward, it was enforced inward. Associates understood that being close to the Twins meant privilege, but it also meant constant risk. One wrong move, one perceived betrayal, and the protection vanished instantly. The very system that gave them power made everyone around them expendable. Ronnie, in particular, began to show signs that something inside him was unraveling. His moods grew less predictable, his aggression sharpened. Where once violence had been instrumental, it increasingly seemed personal. Slights were remembered, insults were nursed. And when Ronnie decided someone had crossed a line, even verbally, the response could be extreme. Reggie often found himself managing not just the business, but his brother's impulses, trying to contain the damage without openly challenging him. That balancing act would become more and more dangerous as their power grew. The wider criminal world took notice. Other gangs watched the Twins carefully. Some aligned with them, others resented them. A few underestimated them and paid for it. The Underworld respects success, but it also resents anyone who rises too fast or draws too much attention. The Twins were doing both. Their mix of visibility and violence made them powerful, but it also painted a target on their backs. Law enforcement, meanwhile, was aware of them, but frustrated. Witnesses refused to speak, evidence evaporated, rumors couldn't be turned into charges. The twins' public image complicated matters. Arresting men who were photographed with celebrities and whispered about in political circles wasn't simple. Every move carried consequences, and in a system already wary of scandal, hesitation became a kind of paralysis. By the early 1960s, the Crays stood at a dangerous peak. They controlled territory, they controlled businesses, they controlled people through fear, debt, and loyalty. And perhaps most dangerously, they believed they were untouchable. That belief is intoxicating. It makes risk feel distant, almost imaginary. It encourages bolder moves, harsher punishments, and a disregard for the limits that eventually catch up with everyone. By the early 1960s, London was reinventing itself, and the Cray Twins positioned themselves perfectly at the intersection of old violence and new glamour. This was the era later romanticized as the swinging 60s, a time when class barriers blurred, nightlife exploded, and rebellion became fashionable. For the Crays, this cultural shift wasn't background noise, it was opportunity. They understood that if they could step out of the shadows and into the spotlight without losing their edge, they could become something far more insulated than ordinary criminals. Nightclubs and gambling venues became their gateways. These spaces were liminal by nature, respectable on the surface, lawless underneath. Celebrities wanted excitement, politicians wanted discretion, businessmen wanted deals done quietly. The twins offered all of that, wrapped in sharp suits and controlled menace. Their establishments weren't just profitable, they were magnets. You didn't go there just to drink or gamble. You went to be seen, to feel close to power, to brush against danger without paying its full price. Reggie leaned hard into this role. He studied how men in films carried themselves, how American gangsters were portrayed. Cool, restrained, always in control. He borrowed the posture, the cadence, the sense of inevitability. When Reggie spoke, he made people feel like they were part of something important. That feeling of inclusion was addictive. It's one of the oldest tricks in power building. Make people believe proximity equals safety. Meanwhile, Ronnie remained the unspoken threat. He didn't need to perform charm. His reputation followed him like a shadow, and that shadow did the talking. Photographers began to circle. Images of the twins in tailored suits appeared alongside actors and musicians. To the public, it looked like a working-class fairy tale. Two East End boys who had made it. To many journalists, the story was irresistible. Crime with style, danger with a smile. The press often treated them less like predators and more like characters. That framing mattered. It softened public perception and complicated police work. When criminals are seen as folk anti-heroes, witnesses hesitate and juries doubt. But beneath the surface, the cost of this double life was rising. Running a criminal empire while maintaining a public image requires discipline and restraint. The twins had discipline, but restraint was another matter. Ronnie's behavior, in particular, grew increasingly volatile. He took slights personally. He became obsessed with respect, with the idea that any insult, real or imagined, demanded retaliation. Violence, once a tool, was becoming an expression. That shift is dangerous because expressive violence isn't calibrated, it escalates. Inside their organization, fear intensified. Associates understood that the twins' success didn't make them safer, it made them more expendable. The stakes were higher, mistakes carried heavier consequences, loyalty was constantly tested, and while Reggie tried to maintain order to keep things businesslike, Ronnie's unpredictability made everyone uneasy. Even hardened criminals began to worry that being close to the twins was no longer worth the risk. Their reach expanded beyond protection rackets and gambling. They moved into blackmail, leveraging secrets gathered in their clubs. People in high places, men with reputations to protect, were especially vulnerable. This was power of a different kind. Not the power of fists or guns, but the power of information. And information, once weaponized, has a way of pulling everyone into the same moral quicksand. Silence becomes complicity. Complicity becomes fear. At the same time, law enforcement was regrouping. The old approach, waiting for witnesses, had failed. The code of silence in the East End was too strong. Police began to understand that the twins' downfall wouldn't come from a single crime or a single testimony. It would come from patience, pressure, and fractures within their own circle. Empires rarely collapse from the outside alone. They rot from within first. The twins' confidence, however, bordered on arrogance. They believed their celebrity protected them. They believed their connections insulated them. They believed that fear could always be managed. This belief encouraged bolder acts, riskier decisions, and a growing sense that consequences were for other people. It's a common pattern in the history of organized crime, the moment when leaders mistake attention for immunity. Personal lives also began to unravel. Relationships strained under secrecy and control. Marriages became battlegrounds. Trust eroded. The very traits that had fueled their rise, intensity, loyalty to each other above all else, contempt for authority, made ordinary human relationships almost impossible to sustain. The twins lived surrounded by people, yet increasingly isolated. As the decade progressed, the violence grew harder to hide. Murders and brutal assaults sent shockwaves through the underworld. Rivals took notice. Some sought revenge. Others quietly stepped away. And crucially, a few began to talk. Not publicly, at first, but enough to give investigators something to work with. The myth of invincibility was cracking. By the mid-1960s, the Cray twins were at their most powerful and most vulnerable at the same time. They had money, fame, and fear on their side, but they were also attracting the kind of scrutiny that no amount of charm could deflect forever. The stage was set for the moment when the spectacle would end and the reckoning would begin. The moment an empire starts to believe its own legend is usually the moment it becomes careless. For the Cray twins, that moment came quietly, wrapped in confidence and applause. They had reached a point where fear worked automatically. Doors opened before they knocked. Problems were sorted before they had to ask. And when you live like that long enough, reality begins to feel optional. That's when mistakes stop looking like mistakes and start looking like entitlement. Inside Ronnie, something darker was taking over. His need for respect was no longer about business. It was personal, obsessive, and absolute. Words mattered to him more than money. A look, a joke, a perceived insult could trigger rage. In the criminal world, where reputation is oxygen, that kind of volatility is dangerous not just to enemies, but to allies. Reggie knew this, he felt it, and more, his role became less about expansion and more about containment, trying to keep Ronnie's impulses from igniting fires they couldn't put out. The killing of George Cornell was one of those fires. It wasn't a calculated hit designed to protect territory or settle a strategic score. It was raw, public, and brazen. A man shot in a pub, in front of witnesses, with no attempt at subtlety. It sent a shock through the underworld and the police alike. For years, fear had kept mouths shut, but this was different. It wasn't just violent, it was reckless. And recklessness breaks the unspoken rules that even criminals rely on to survive. Ronnie didn't hide his satisfaction. That too was a mistake. Violence that is enjoyed becomes impossible to justify as necessary. It exposes motive. It reveals character. And while witnesses still hesitated to come forward, something shifted. People began to whisper that the twins were losing control, that they were becoming liabilities rather than protectors. In a world built on calculated risk, being unpredictable is often worse than being brutal. Reggie tried to steady the ship, but another tragedy loomed, one that would haunt their story forever. His marriage to Frances Shay was, on the surface, an attempt at normalcy. She represented a life that wasn't entirely consumed by fear and secrecy, but the reality of being married to a man like Reggie, surrounded by danger, lies, and long absences, was unbearable. Frances was young, vulnerable, and trapped in a world she didn't choose. Her death, officially ruled a suicide, cast a long shadow. Rumors swirled, whispers hardened, and once again the twins found themselves surrounded by suspicion that couldn't be proven, but couldn't be erased either. Every unresolved death adds weight. Every rumor narrows your circle. People who once felt protected start to feel exposed. Associates begin to ask themselves a dangerous question. What happens if I'm next? That question is the seed of betrayal. And by the late 1960s, the seed was sprouting. The murder of Jack the Hat McVitie was the breaking point. Unlike earlier acts of violence, this killing didn't even pretend to serve a higher purpose. It was messy, personal, and avoidable. Worse, it involved people who didn't have the twins' long history of loyalty. Men who were scared, unstable, and not willing to go down for someone else's ego. When McVitie was killed, the sense of inevitability around the twins began to collapse. Fear was no longer enough to hold everything together. At the same time, law enforcement had changed tactics. Instead of chasing headlines, they focused on patience. They understood that you don't break a fortress by charging the front gate. You wait for someone inside to open a door. Deals were quietly offered. Pressure was applied selectively, and eventually it worked. One by one, members of the twin circle began to talk, not out of courage, but out of self-preservation. The arrests, when they came, were sweeping, not just Ronnie and Reggie, but their network. The shock wasn't that the police moved in, it was that they moved in with confidence, evidence, testimony, structure. For the first time, the twins weren't reacting, they were being managed. And in court, their carefully crafted image began to crumble. The sharp suits couldn't hide the brutality. The celebrity photographs couldn't drown out the witnesses. The myth was finally being forced to answer to reality. The trial was a spectacle. The public watched, fascinated, as two men who had once seemed untouchable sat under judgment. But beneath the drama, something quieter was happening. The twins were facing a truth they had avoided their entire lives. Fear has a shelf life. Eventually, it stops working. People get tired. People get desperate. And when fear no longer guarantees silence, it becomes just another weakness. Conviction was inevitable. Life sentences followed. The empire was over. But the story didn't end there, because prison doesn't erase who you are. It amplifies it. Prison stripped away the illusion faster than anything else ever could. The suits, the clubs, the whispers of power, all of it evaporated the moment the cell door closed. For the first time since their rise began, Ronnie and Reggie Cray were no longer directing events. They were reacting to them. And for men who had built their entire identities around control, that loss cut deeper than the sentences themselves. Ronnie's descent was immediate and severe. Behind bars, the traits that had once made him feared, his intensity, his paranoia, his obsession with respect, became unmanageable. Prison is a pressure cooker, and Ronnie's mind could not withstand it. He was isolated, watched constantly, denied the informal power structures that sometimes allow dominant prisoners to recreate hierarchy. Without an audience to intimidate or a brother to steady him, his mental state deteriorated rapidly. Eventually, doctors diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. For some, that diagnosis explained what they believed had always been there. For others, it raised uncomfortable questions about responsibility, violence, and how much of Ronnie's brutality had been illness rather than choice. But for the system, explanation didn't mean mercy. It meant containment. Ronnie was transferred to Broadmoor, a high-security psychiatric hospital. There, his world became smaller still. Rooms, routines, medication, and memories. Yet even inside Broadmoor, the legend followed him. Staff knew who he was. Other patients knew his name. Fame, even in confinement, has a strange persistence. Ronnie leaned into it when he could, recounting stories, rewriting moments in his mind until he was once again the dominant figure. But time is relentless. As years passed, the performances lost their edge. The body weakened, the rage dulled. What remained was a man locked in a loop of memory, still convinced of his own importance, but increasingly disconnected from the world that had once validated it. Reggie's path was different, quieter, and in some ways more tragic. He was imprisoned in a standard facility, surrounded by men who knew exactly who he was, but who no longer feared him the way they once might have. Without Ronnie's looming presence, Reggie was exposed. He had to live with memory instead of momentum. Unlike his brother, Reggie had always been more reflective, more capable of self-awareness. In prison, that awareness became a burden. He began to understand the cost of their choices, not in abstract terms, but in the faces of people he would never see again. It was during these years that Reggie turned toward religion. Becoming a born-again Christian gave him language for guilt, regret, and redemption, concepts that had no place in the world he once ruled. Whether this transformation was genuine or partly driven by the need for structure is still debated, but those close to him later suggested that Reggie was haunted, not by the loss of power, but by the realization that he had always known where the road ended and chose it anyway. Both brothers were allowed, under heavy guard, to attend their mother Violet's funeral. That moment was symbolic in ways few others were. Violet had been the constant, the emotional anchor, the one person whose approval truly mattered to them. Standing there, restrained and surrounded by police, the twins were forced to confront a life reduced to ceremony and regret. The woman who had protected them from consequences for so long was gone, and nothing stood between them and the reality of what they had become. Outside prison walls, something strange was happening. The legend was growing. Books were written, films were discussed, journalists revisited old photographs. The Crays, stripped of power, became characters, mythical figures frozen in time. This is one of the most unsettling aspects of their story, how easily violence can be aestheticized once it's no longer an immediate threat. For people who hadn't lived under their shadow, the twins were fascinating. For those who had, the fascination felt like betrayal. Even from behind bars, the name Cray retained value. Businesses were formed, bodyguard services were advertised, connections were exploited. The irony was stark. Men imprisoned for controlling fear were still indirectly benefiting from it. Their name had become a brand, detached from the suffering it represented. This wasn't power in the old sense, but it was influence, and influence once established is difficult to erase. As years turned into decades, the physical toll became undeniable. Ronnie's health declined, heart problems emerged. The body that once symbolized menace weakened. In 1995, he died at the age of 61. The response was complicated. Some mourned him as a legend. Others felt relief. Many felt nothing at all, only distance. Reggie was allowed to attend the funeral without handcuffs, a gesture that spoke less about forgiveness and more about the exhaustion of the story. Reggie's final chapter came not long after. Diagnosed with terminal cancer, he was released on compassionate grounds. After decades in prison, freedom was brief and fragile. He died in 2000, surrounded by family, far from the empire he once helped build. The twins were buried together, united in death as they had been in life. The symmetry appealed to storytellers. Reality, however, was less poetic. The question that lingered wasn't whether they were guilty. That had been settled long ago. It was why their story refused to fade, why even after everything, people still spoke their names. Part of the answer lies in how perfectly their lives fit a certain narrative. Rise from poverty, defiance of authority, glamour, downfall. But narratives simplify. They smooth over the damage. They turn real pain into entertainment. By the time both brothers were dead, the Cray twins no longer existed as men. They existed as symbols, and symbols are dangerous because they can be reshaped to suit whoever is telling the story. In the years after their imprisonment, and especially after their deaths, their lives were retold again and again, often stripped of context, consequence, and pain. What remained was a stylized version of violence that fit neatly into films, books, and late-night conversations. The Crays became less about what they did and more about what people wanted them to represent. For some, they were framed as working-class rebels who beat a system rigged against them. For others, they were romanticized as sharp-dressed anti-heroes who lived fast and refused to bow. This framing ignored an uncomfortable truth. The people who paid the real price for the twins' rise were not faceless institutions or corrupt elites. They were ordinary people, shopkeepers, associates, partners, and bystanders who lived with fear as part of daily life. Fear isn't cinematic when you're the one carrying it home every night. The glamorization of the twins says as much about society as it does about them. There is a long tradition, especially in Western culture, of mythologizing outlaws. When institutions feel distant or unjust, figures who openly defy authority can be mistaken for symbols of freedom. But the Crays didn't challenge power structures to liberate anyone. They replaced one form of domination with another, more personal and often more brutal. Their rule didn't create justice, it created silence. Class played a major role in how their story was received. The image of East End boys rising into elite circles tapped into deep cultural tensions in Britain. To some, their success felt like revenge against snobbery. To others, it was proof of moral decay, but both sides often missed the same point. Power gained through fear doesn't elevate a community, it isolates it. The twins didn't lift the East End, they trapped parts of it in a cycle of intimidation that outlasted their own freedom. Masculinity is another thread that runs through their legacy. The Crays embodied a version of manhood built on dominance, control, and emotional suppression. Vulnerability was weakness, respect was non-negotiable, violence was proof of identity. This model didn't just harm their victims, it hollowed them out as individuals. Ronnie's mental collapse and Reggie's quiet regret weren't accidents. They were the long-term cost of living a life where empathy is treated as a liability. The entertainment industry played its part. Films and books often focused on style over substance, on quotable lines over consequences. Violence was framed as dramatic rather than traumatic. This kind of storytelling doesn't require malicious intent to cause harm. It simply prioritizes engagement over truth. When audiences consume these narratives without context, they absorb a distorted lesson. That power is glamorous, that fear commands respect, that consequences are optional until the very end. But the real legacy of the Crays is less exciting and far more instructive. Their story is a case study in how unchecked power corrodes from the inside, how loyalty enforced through fear eventually collapses, how celebrity can act as a temporary shield but never a permanent one, and how systems, whether criminal or institutional, eventually respond when recklessness replaces calculation. There's also a quieter lesson about silence. The East End's code of not speaking to police wasn't born from loyalty to the Crays. It came from generations of mistrust, poverty, and survival instincts. The twins exploited that silence expertly, but they didn't create it. And when the silence finally broke, it wasn't because people suddenly became brave. It was because fear changed direction. That shift matters. It shows that fear is not loyalty, and it is never stable. Even today, the fascination continues. People claim distant connections. Tourists visit old locations. The twins' names still sell, but each retelling moves a little further away from reality. The sharper the myth becomes, the duller the truth gets. And the truth is this: the Cray twins didn't conquer London. They burned through it briefly, leaving damage that others had to clean up. To understand why the Cray twins ultimately failed, you have to place them beside the longer history of organized crime rather than above it. They were not anomalies. They were a variation on an old pattern, one that appears whenever weak institutions, social division, and public fascination intersect. What made the Crays distinctive wasn't their brutality or ambition, but the environment that allowed both to be mistaken for charisma. Organized crime, at its most durable, operates quietly. It avoids spectacle. It minimizes attention. The most successful criminal empires survive not by intimidating everyone all the time, but by becoming boring, predictable, almost invisible. The Crays did the opposite. They invited attention. They cultivated it. They thrived on it. And while that strategy accelerated their rise, it also guaranteed their collapse. Their model depended heavily on personality, Ronnie's fear factor, Reggie's social intelligence. Together, they formed a system that revolved around two individuals rather than a stable structure. This is a critical weakness. When power is concentrated too tightly, the system cannot adapt if one element falters. Ronnie's mental instability wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a structural flaw. As his behavior became more erratic, the organization lost coherence. Violence stopped serving strategy and started serving impulse. Another flaw was the way the twins handled loyalty. True loyalty is built on mutual benefit and shared survival. The Crays relied instead on intimidation and emotional manipulation. Associates stayed close because they were scared of leaving, not because they believed in the future of the enterprise. That kind of loyalty evaporates the moment fear shifts, from the boss to the police, from punishment to prison. When that shift happened, the firm didn't defend itself. It collapsed inward. Their relationship with authority was equally short-sighted. While they enjoyed flirting with politicians, celebrities, and social elites, they misunderstood the nature of those relationships. Proximity is not protection. Influence borrowed from fame or scandal is temporary. When pressure becomes inconvenient, the powerful distance themselves quickly. The twins mistook access for alliance and paid the price when those doors closed without warning. The broader cultural moment also changed. The swinging 60s didn't last forever. As social optimism faded and crime statistics hardened, public tolerance for flamboyant lawlessness declined. The same society that once found the twins fascinating began to see them as embarrassing relics of excess. Law enforcement adapted. Media narratives shifted. What once sold as glamour began to look like decay. Comparing the Crays to other criminal figures makes the lesson clearer. Those who endure understand discretion. They diversify leadership. They suppress ego. The Crays did none of these consistently. Ego wasn't just part of their identity, it was the engine. And engines that run hot without regulation eventually destroy themselves. Yet despite all this, the fascination remains. Why? Because the twins embodied contradictions people struggle to resolve. They were violent yet articulate, ruthless yet generous in selective ways, criminals who moved among elites, victims of circumstance who also created immense suffering. These contradictions make for compelling stories, but they don't make for admirable lives. The danger in revisiting such stories is forgetting the human cost. Every myth needs victims to disappear into the background. In the case of the Crays, those victims included people whose names aren't remembered, whose lives were derailed quietly, whose fear never made headlines. The twins' story didn't just end with prison sentences, it echoed through families, neighborhoods, and institutions long after the cameras moved on. There is also a lesson here about masculinity and power that extends far beyond East London. The idea that strength requires domination, that respect must be enforced, that vulnerability is weakness, these beliefs don't just create criminals. They create systems of harm. Ronnie's collapse and Reggie's regret weren't exceptions to the rule. They were its logical conclusion. As we move toward the end of this series, the focus shifts from what the Krays did to what their story means now. Why do we keep returning to it? What are we really fascinated by? Crime, rebellion, or the illusion of control? And what responsibility do storytellers have when retelling lives built on fear? By the time the Cray Twins entered popular culture as permanent fixtures, their real lives had already been reduced to raw material. Filmmakers, writers, and publishers weren't dealing with living men anymore. They were dealing with a brand, and brands invite exaggeration. Dialogue gets sharper, violence gets cleaner, consequences get delayed or softened. The messiness of real suffering doesn't translate well to screens or book jackets, so it's often pushed aside. This is where the ethical tension becomes unavoidable. Telling history is not the same as selling it, yet much of what the public now knows about the Krays comes from dramatizations designed to entertain first and inform second. These retellings often focus on aesthetics, tailored suits, smoky clubs, witty one-liners, while compressing or skipping over the long, grinding fear their presence created. In doing so, they risk turning intimidation into style and brutality into attitude. The twins themselves would have loved this version of the story. They were deeply image-conscious. Ronnie, in particular, enjoyed the idea of being remembered as powerful and feared. Reggie wanted to be seen as sophisticated, as more than a thug. Popular culture gave them both exactly what they wanted, long after they were gone. But giving someone their preferred legacy doesn't make it truthful. It makes it convenient. There's also a deeper cultural question at play. Why are audiences so drawn to criminal figures who appear confident, decisive, and unrestrained? Part of the answer lies in frustration. When systems feel slow, unfair, or distant, people are tempted by figures who seem to bypass them entirely. The Krays didn't wait for permission, they took what they wanted. That fantasy of acting without consequence is powerful, but it's also dangerous because it ignores who pays the price when rules are broken selectively. Another reason the fascination persists is proximity. The Krays weren't distant mob bosses operating in abstract spaces. They were visible. They lived among ordinary people. They attended events. They were photographed with celebrities. That closeness blurs moral boundaries. It makes evil feel familiar, and familiarity can dull judgment. When criminals look like neighbors or movie stars, it becomes easier to overlook what they actually do. Modern retellings also tend to flatten complexity. Ronnie becomes the mad one, Reggie becomes the smart one. These labels are easy to remember, but they oversimplify reality. Ronnie was capable of calculation. Reggie was capable of cruelty. Both made choices repeatedly over years that harmed others. Mental illness may explain behavior, but it doesn't erase responsibility, especially when systems were in place to intervene and were ignored or manipulated. There's a responsibility that comes with revisiting stories like this, especially for modern audiences. It's not enough to ask, what happened? We also have to ask, how is this being framed? Are we learning or are we consuming? Are we examining power or admiring it? The difference matters because stories shape values and values shape behavior. The Krays' story is often cited as uniquely British, rooted in class, post-war trauma, and East End culture. But the pattern repeats everywhere. When society glamorizes those who dominate through fear, it sends a message, subtle but persistent, that power justifies itself. That message doesn't stay in history. It moves forward, influencing how people interpret success, masculinity, and authority. Perhaps the most unsettling part of their legacy is how little space is given to redemption that doesn't involve fame. Reggie's quiet religious turn, his regret, his attempt, however imperfect, to make sense of his life rarely gets the same attention as his crimes. That's telling. We are more interested in spectacle than in reflection, more drawn to rise and fall than to what comes after the fall. As we approach the final part of this series, the question is no longer who the Cray twins were. That's been answered. The real question is why their story still matters and what it warns us about today. Because history doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it does echo, and if we listen carefully, those echoes can tell us as much about ourselves as they do about two brothers from East London. When the noise fades, when the headlines are archived, the films stop rolling, and the photographs lose their shock value, what remains of the Cray twins is not a legend, but a warning. Their story, stripped of glamour and myth, is ultimately about the short life of fear-based power and the long shadow it leaves behind. Ronnie and Reggie Cray did not rise because they were uniquely brilliant or uniquely evil. They rose because they understood something very simple. In a fractured society, fear travels faster than trust. They learned how to weaponize silence, how to turn reputation into armor, and how to make people believe resistance was pointless. For a time, that worked. It always does, for a time. But fear is not loyalty, and intimidation is not stability. Every empire built on those foundations eventually collapses under its own weight. Their downfall was not sudden. It was slow, inevitable, and largely self-inflicted. Ego replaced discipline. Violence replaced strategy. Image replaced caution. Ronnie's unchecked volatility and Reggie's willingness to manage it rather than confront it sealed their fate. Together, they created a system that could not survive change, illness, scrutiny, or time. When pressure mounted, the structure didn't bend. It cracked. What makes their story linger is not what they achieved, but how easily society helped them do it. The code of silence, the fascination with outlaws, the press's hunger for spectacle, the elites who enjoyed proximity to danger without accountability, the systems that hesitated until damage was irreversible. The Crays didn't operate in a vacuum. They thrived in the gaps between responsibility and attention. And then there is the cost, often ignored, rarely named. The shopkeepers who paid because they were afraid, the associates who lived one mistake away from death, the families shattered by violence, the women trapped in relationships defined by control and fear, the communities that learned to survive by looking away. These are not footnotes to the story. They are the story. The final irony is this: the twins spent their lives chasing respect, yet earned only fear. And fear, once its source is gone, evaporates. What replaces it is judgment, reflection, distance. Ronnie died confined by his own mind. Reggie died free but haunted, carrying an awareness that came too late to matter. Neither ended as rulers, both ended as examples. So why does the story still matter now? Because the conditions that created the Crays haven't disappeared. They resurface whenever inequality hardens, institutions lose trust, and power is mistaken for dominance. Whenever society rewards image over accountability, whenever violence is aestheticized and consequences are delayed, the names change, the locations change, the pattern does not. This is not a story about admiration. It is a story about limits, about what happens when fear is allowed to masquerade as strength, about how charisma can distract from cruelty, about how quickly the line between fascination and complicity can blur. And perhaps most importantly, it's a reminder that myths are choices. We choose which stories to polish, which details to soften, which truths to confront. We can tell these stories as warnings, or we can sell them as entertainment. The difference is not neutral. It shapes what the next generation learns to admire. The Cray twins ruled London briefly, but history did not crown them. It confined them, diagnosed them, buried them, and moved on. What remains is not their power, but the lesson they left behind. Fear can build empires, but it cannot sustain them.